to break out.
When, on the morning of the 25th, we had received an order that the battalion was to try and make its own way out, hoping that in a large number of people pulling out, some would succeed, I felt it was probably the only thing that could be done. That meant leaving our sick and wounded, which our medical officer said he could not leave. He and the medics and the padre decided to stay with the sick and wounded, which was a brave thing for them to do and a selfless thing for them to do.
As the Gloucesters began their own escape, attempts were made to help the brigade's other forward positions. John Martin had only arrived on the Imjin the previous evening with his friend Dickie Tamblin. As last-minute reinforcements for the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, their orders were to resupply the battalion's weakened positions.
We set off through the entrance of the valley, and we were literally, from the word go, we were literally like a race course. We were literally flat out. Carriers were bouncing, a very rough road. And we were having to hook our legs and hands into the ammunition boxes to hang on. I saw flashes of tracer going over our heads, and that was the crack of the shells exploding on the hillside beside us. And when I turned around again, Dickie was slumped over, and the back of his head was blown off, and he slowly tipped over to one side, fell onto the exhaust grills. I remember thinking to myself very clearly, and it's lived with me ever since, I'm glad it wasn't me. A terrible thing to say and think, but it just seemed automatic. I'm just glad it wasn't me.
Days of stubborn resistance had bought the UN precious time. They had saved Seoul. Now these men had to save themselves.
At that point, we had no choice. We were told, you're in a hopeless situation. While there's still a gap in the valley, come out. Come out as, not as regiments, not as companies, come out as sections, which is 5 or 6 men at a time.
With time running out, the tanks of the 8th King Irish Royal Hussars were given the rescue order. They were told to race up the valley towards the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers and Royal Ulster Rifles and get them out. On this rescue column was Dennis Wybrow.
We've got to make a road up there and try and get the infantry out. That was more or less a death of glory sort of stunt.
As John Dyer descended from the hills with the Chinese at his heels, he was relieved to see the tanks.
We were told the only way you're going to get out is come out with us. So as we climbed up onto the tank, I was pulling my mate up. He was knocked off. I don't know what happened to him. As I was climbing onto the tank, a Chinaman tried to pull me off. So what did I do? Everything else was up on the tank. You put your rifle up, then you climb up afterwards. So I just booted him. He got a military boot straight in his face. That made him let go.
The courageous Chinese became suicidal in their ferocity as they saw the tanks taking the survivors back down the valley.
The tanks were going straight through them. And that's all I could hear was these people screaming, being crushed by the tanks as they went through them. Quite a horrible experience.
It was only when John Dyer's tank finally reached safety that the full horror of what had happened became clear.
It was just a mess. Just a mess. The sides of the tank was covered in blood. All the tracks was all full of limbs. It was a mess. It was a mess. Actually, so much so that we were taken off into the tent so that we wouldn't see any more of it. But it was a horrible mess.
The medics tried their best for those who escaped this valley of death.
They jumped on the tanks for a ride out, and of course they'd Really, they concentrated the targets for the Chinese to shoot at, I suppose, hadn't they? And we started lifting the casualties off, and we were having to put dead to one side and doing what we could with the living. We were getting ricochet wounds and all sorts of things where the bullets had bounced off the sides of the tank and gone through them. It was a very strange feeling, that was, dealing with them.
During this fourth and last day of the battle, the Chinese finally succeeded in taking Gloucester Hill. Sam Davies waited for the end.
We all stood there with our hands raised. Mercifully, no shots were fired. There was a fleeting thought we might have been just mown down, but no. And we had to place our hands on our heads. The young Chinese officer said, you will go down the hill with your hands on your heads. Any movement and you can be shot. And so we set off, the doctor and I, the remains of the medical staff, and helping several of the walking wounded, the very badly wounded, and those who were dying, we couldn't, they had to be left.
Farrah Hockley tried to find a way out of this trap, but he too was forced to surrender.
It was a very shameful moment, surrendering. I hated doing it. Surrendering seemed to go against everything that I thought soldiering should be about.
In the confusion after the battle, those who had escaped from the hills had no idea who was missing, who was dead, who had been taken prisoner.
And the next morning they had a roll call. You had to give a report to anybody you knew who'd been killed, and all the details were all written down by the officer.
Every now and again you'd hear, sir, but most of the time you were getting killed, sir, missing, sir, killed, sir. And it seemed that the ones that were left, there was a lot more missing and killed than we had left standing there. I mean, when I looked along the line of what was left, it didn't seem very much.
More than 500 British soldiers were taken prisoner on the Imjin. The Chinese photographed them, eager to show the world the defeat they saw written on these exhausted faces. They were then marched over the Imjin River, deep into North Korea.
That was a very long march, of course. We didn't get to the prison camps until November of that year, most of us. We were all already very tired. We'd had very little to eat. We were getting more and more tired, of course. Some people dropped out, some were just shot by the guards and left to die.
But the Chinese had paid a heavy price too. Many were taken prisoner. On the Imjin alone, 10,000 Chinese troops had been killed. Having failed to make the breakthrough, Marshal Peng withdrew his battered army north again. This was a turning point in the war. Never again would the Chinese attempt an offensive of this kind and threaten South Korea. The UN was now able to create a yet stronger defensive line back on the river. The return to the Imjin also allowed the British dead to be identified. A more dignified burial would follow, with personal effects sent back to loved ones at home.
There were our blokes what were dead up there, and we got to dig them up, identify them. So the volunteers, I asked for volunteers, so we went up. There's a big bond, you build up a bond between blokes, don't you? Comradeship, isn't it? You don't like to let anybody down. I mean, you were pals with them when they were alive, you're not going to be frightened of them when they're dead. That's the way I looked at things.
With the dead buried, the brigade's thoughts turned to comrades who had been taken prisoner and disappeared into North Korea. Their own long march to the POW camps would be an exhausting 400 miles. Once in the camps, the